Acceptability in society, I feel, are changing because of the media.
Police officers do go for training, still getting it wrong.
Encouraging individuals to report it.
They don't even understand the difference between a Sikh and a Muslim.
Have to understand to respect. I don't understand electricity, but I use it every day. And
You've got some of the horrific things, people using social media, which are then very difficult to track people.
Welcome to another edition of the Stigma Show. And as you know, over the last few weeks, we've been looking at hate crime. Today, we're going to be concentrating on what it actually means for an individual person. You've all probably experienced walking down the street, being called names because of the way that you dress, the way that you look, because of your gender, because of your own sexual preferences. There's a whole host of reasons why you may have heard somebody call you names. Where does it start from? It tends to start from the school ground, from playgrounds, as we've heard in other episodes. Starts at a very early age. So today on the show, let me introduce you to our guests. We've got Rose Simkins, and you're from Stop Hate UK. Everybody knows Sukhi from The Breakfast Show. We've also got Lee Dargue, and you're a prospective Lib Dem candidate for Edgebaston. And we've got Vikram Singh, who's a clinical researcher. Now, if I just throw some statistics at you, Rose, to begin with, 26,000 counselling candidates reported that their children had been subjected to some form of bullying in school last year alone. 26,000. It's a huge number. Is that something that you've picked up with your campaign because you're a support group?
yes, I mean, what we know is that lots of people are experiencing what we would call targeted crimes. They're targeted because of an aspect of their identity, and that can be many and varied, including obviously the protected characteristics and the issues around race and gender identity and things. But it's also about whether somebody has red hair. It's about, if somebody is identified as being from an alternative subculture, or very poor and maybe not so clean. There's lots of reasons why people are targeted, and it is commonplace. Yeah.
Vikram, I wanted to come to you initially at the early stages, just to set a picture in terms of you and your experiences turning from a Sikh boy who's got a haircut to a Sikh lad who decides to wear the star.
Yes, I'm sure many people are aware, having talked about it before on Sikh Channel, that I wasn't always a Kesatari Sikh. I decided to keep my gaze just before going to secondary school, and that was in 2001. And at the same time, when I kept my gaze, I made the decision that I'm not going to tie a patka. I'm not going to do the little gutti. I'm going to tie the star, and I decided to tie a turban to secondary school from the very first day. And my first real experience, of having something negative associated with this change in my life was shortly after the incident of 9/11. It was something as simple as, walking home from school, went into the shops, come out the shops, and a lad who's bigger than me, much older than me. So I'm in year 7. This kid, I think he was in year 11, and he's just come up to me and punched me in the face.
So year 7, you would have been how old?
About 11, 12, so about 11, I think. At the time, I was confused. I mean, I didn't know. I was just thinking, why is this guy punching me in my face? And, but there was also the verbal abuse that came with it. And, then the penny kind of drops. It's because, especially with at the time in the news, you know, there was a shots of, you know, Bin Laden being plastered on every news channel of him with a beard and a turban, and the turban at that time got, in a sense, disgraced as becoming an international symbol of terrorism. And me, as a child, I was only a child when I was 11 years old. You know, when I first started school, suddenly, an innocent child has now been stigmatized. You know, he's wearing a turban, and, you know, someone who's ignorant, you know, who was ignorant to my faith, to my culture, to my background, has just seen me wearing a turban, associated it with terrorism, and decided to punch me in the face.
Lee, obviously that would have been a really traumatic experience for any 11-year-old. For Vikram, obviously, we know that it was, but for any 11-year-old to go through something like that, how do you think that would have affected their mental status?
Well, that's one of the big things that we've really focused on, sort of socially as well as politically, over the last 5 years. Really, it's sort of grown, is how it affects people's mental well-being, the physical well-being. I was sort of bullied at school for my weight. I'm a lot sort of smaller than I was then, so I understand the physical side. It's a cliche but true that, you know, wounds heal and so on, but of course how it affects you and how it knocks your confidence, which then affects your ability to maybe form relationships or to get a job or to form a family. And one of the other things that I'd just like to bring in is that it's very different from when I was at school, in terms of it was really physical or verbal, whereas now you've got some of the horrific things, people using social media, which are then very difficult to track people. Sometimes it's done anonymously. People can message you by getting your number from somebody you don't know who it is. So we've got such a mass ability for people to sort of be bullied or harassed or anything like that. So a lot of it, as you say, can start in school. Unfortunately, it could be argued as a human tendency where differences are seen, that people focus on those. So really, by getting people at a young age to start understanding that differences are fine, that we should concentrate more on where we're the same, very much where my party believes in sort of communities, and I know it does in the Sikh faith, in terms of communities and equality and sharing values and beliefs. It's about getting people to work with each other, and I think that's really important, because that allows people to stop focusing on the differences, which is where a lot of this hate can actually come from.
Sukhi, you've also experienced a lot of hatred, racism, possibly sexism. Do you want to share your experience?
So my experience was in the playground. There was a girl who was a lot sort of older than me. I was an infant.
How old were you?
I was only 7. So she was a lot older, and it was mainly in the playground, because we used to have dinner ladies that were on duty, not your classroom teachers. So, you know, the dinner ladies didn't used to care. She used to literally pin me up against a wall and take my lunch money off me. And me being scared, I used to just, you know, give her the dinner money and off I trotted. But I didn't tell anyone because I was scared she was going to attack me, or, you know, the fact that she pinned me up against a wall, I had that fear inside me. So
it appears that it's still quite there. You've gone back to being that 7-year-old child, and it's an experience that hasn't let go. No. How has it affected you throughout the whole of your life then?
I think it kind of like, I lack confidence. People probably watch me on The Breakfast Show and probably think, oh no, you know, she's quite confident. I've kind of like passed it now, but through the rest of school, I was very sort of nervous child. You know, my teachers had to sort of egg me on to try and like stand up and, you know, have to read in assembly, things like that. It used to make me really, really scared and nervous. I told my parents, but Asian parents are doing the same. They'd be like, oh, just ignore it, you know, just it's probably just kids being kids, you know, you're being silly, it's probably your fault, whatever. And just never sort of encouraged me to sort of stand up and speak about it. Had I done that, maybe, you know, I would have had a different sort of experience in school. By the time she left school, you know, then I was kind of like reassured, you know, she's gone now, she can't sort of get me at break times, I can sort of, you know, join with the rest of the children.
Especially within our community, there is a cycle of abuse. Now, I I was having a conversation with my mum, and you know, we were talking about school, talking about her school days, and she told me that when she used to get bullied at school or beat up at school, she was more scared to go back and tell mum and dad, because they would blame her and say, no, ignore it, keep your head down. And I thought to myself, why? And I think it needs to be taken back a generation to when our grandparents and great-grandparents came to this country for the first time in the 50s, 60s and 70s. They faced a lot of discrimination within the workplace. They faced a lot of abuse, which today would be, it was crime, to discriminate against them, to bully them, to harass them. In foundries, they'd be sworn at, they'd be racially abused, called names, spat at, treated differently. And what was the way? How did they tackle it? They tackled it by ignoring it, because they thought, we're in this country, we need to work, put food on the table for our kids so they can go to school, they can educate themselves, so they can get us out of this rut of us having to toil away in foundries. So their remedy to the abuse that they faced was to ignore it, brush it under the carpet. And so what do they pass on to their children? If you face it, brush it under the carpet, ignore it, study, study, study.
But isn't
it's become
that just about fear? Because one of the things that we and obviously haven't been party to any of the other discussions, and one of the things that we have picked up is that hate crime or any form of bullying is about the perpetrator being in fear. So because they're in fear of something, and it could be anything, that's why they inflict that pain, that behaviour on somebody that they think is not going to fight back or is not going to attack back at them. And surely that needs to change, obviously, so that the perpetrator becomes the person who feels that they are going to be challenged about it. And obviously there has been legislation that's come into light, over the years. And that cycle, I understand, it still continues to exist. But is it just about an Asian community? Because I think that cycle probably is a cycle that anybody who is different would have faced anyway. Working class children would have faced exactly the same. If they'd been to school, you smell, you haven't got the same, access to the pocket money. Go and sit in the back. You can't sit here. Only a rich person, may have been able to find the sixpence in a Christmas pudding or something. So all these things happened across the board, not just, I don't think, to a particular class.
No, I agree with you, but I'm just using the example from our community because it's it's something that I've heard and firsthand. But you've mentioned the perpetrator has a fear, but there is also a fear to stand up and do the right thing.
Rose, why do you think that when something like this happens, when an act of bullying happens, immediately teachers or parents tend to brush it under the carpet as, oh, it's just kids being kids?
Well, there are obviously really difficult things to deal with sometimes, especially in a pressurised situation in school where teachers have, an awful lot that they have to do as they'll look after everybody's well-being as well. But I think we tend to sort of underestimate things, and we tend to blame, in maybe sometimes a subtle way, we blame the person who's being targeted. What did you do? And we do this with women all the time, in terms of domestic violence. What did you do to make this situation worse? Or why did you walk down that street? And so I think maybe it's a sort of a second nature to us that we start to think about what our own, that person's responsibility. And because in school and in colleges and in workplaces, what's happening, they're criminal acts. And I think it's we don't want to criminalise children and give children a criminal record. But if children are doing things that when they're older, once they're over the age of 10 and the age of criminal responsibility in the UK, if they're doing that, or they're doing stuff that we can handle in the school, in theory, if they do this out on the street, or they do this when they're older, they are going to be arrested and they are going to have a criminal record. And I think sometimes we need to be pointing out to people, you know, even if we deal with it in a different sort of way around mediation or some other sort of punishment, that actually there's criminal activity going on here and really damaging. You know, we talk about physical violence, and sometimes some of the people we support, it's the people who are getting the name calling, the verbal abuse, the sort of being left out of things. They are the people who are really damaged, and the longer these sorts of incidents go on, the longer you are targeted for. And if you haven't got the confidence to be able to work through it yourself, you will experience damage, and then it changes your whole life after that in terms of your ability to interact, build relationships, and actually become a valued member of society, and actually be able to give your contribution and be your best if you're carrying this load of being targeted.
Lee, 92% of teenagers who were either lesbian or gay were bullied. These are figures from last year. 41% of children, regardless of their background, were physically bullied, and there was 17% that had death threats. This is all children and playground behaviour that's operational within the education system. Yet we don't hear anything from any of people in power to say that we're going to tackle this horrendous bullying with children on a national level. We've got religious education classes. They teach us about this person and this religion and that religion. But schools don't tend to teach us about tolerance. We might have a Diwali party, we might have a Christmas party, we might have an Eid party, but is that really teaching people tolerance?
I think you're absolutely right. I think there's tolerance, there's also building resilience as well. I think my main issue with how governments have been going for the last 20 years maybe is that it's all about targets, and it's all about exams, and it's all about robust testing, and it's all about funneling children into a particular avenue to do something. And I think that what we forget in the education system, and I'm a teacher as well, and I see it sometimes with some teachers or establishments, is that we seem to see the child as, well, they come in at 11, they're going to leave at 16, say in a high school, maybe go to college. Well, our whole purpose is to get them in and get them out with a GCSE. Well, actually what we don't realise is these children come into the classroom with their own little worlds, and they have family issues and relationship issues and maybe issues of bullying and harassment. So I think the focus has been so much by governments, because they're driven by what they think people want numbers all the time, that they don't take into account all of these other issues around bullying, harassment. And I think there has been some move, it's particularly in the LGBT area, over the last sort of couple of years, to try and tackle this. It's been very much box-ticking exercises, though. We'll come and get somebody to come and give a talk, which is good, and then they've considered that's all they need to do. Whereas people are then, for example, going online out of school and having issues. So, yeah, it's very much an issue that can fester and boil over in a school, but it can now carry on outside of schools. And I think politicians, if we use them as a collective, have failed in many ways by seeing exam results as the sole purpose of developing a child. And you mentioned other things like, other faiths and other religions or not religious, and all of these people about tolerance and so on, that it just doesn't get enough focus on. And I think we need to move away from targets of exams as being the sole reason that people are at school.
Why do you think people who are subjected to any form of bullying, any form of hate crime, any criminal activity are afraid to stand up?
There are just so many reasons why people don't come forward and report hate crime or hate incidents. And it's not just about reporting, it's making sure it's recorded as such. And often there is a huge difference between people who think they've reported and those that are recorded. And there are so many reasons why people don't come forward. And it's fear of reprisals, not wanting to make a fuss, thinking this is how it is, this is what I deserve. There are cultural issues. There's such a long list. And so when people contact our helpline at Stop Hate UK, one of the things I would say to our team that are answering the phone is you must start from the standpoint of, wow, this person has gone through a huge number of barriers, you know, in order to be even speaking about it. That there's shame, there's embarrassment, there's what's the point? Does anybody care? And it just goes on and on. There are more reasons not to do it than to do it for most people, and all we can say is nothing will change unless we start to talk about what's happening to us. And there is all this thing about I can't make a fuss. If I come forward, will I make it worse? Not just for myself, but for people who are like me. And until we actually start to get to a point where as individuals we're not going to tolerate it, but as a society we're not going to stand by and let it happen to other people, nothing will change.
Sukhi? Like I said, I was just scared because, you know, I knew that girl was going to be there. You know, she may attack me. That was the fear. I actually work in a school now. So I work in a primary school, and what I do is I'm just extra vigilant, and I don't sort of just turn a blind eye to the, you know, the child that's just playing on his own in the playground. I try and encourage them to sort of, you know, take part. You know, teachers are busy. You know, my class teacher, she's got so many paperwork that she has to do. You know, she has to get all the targets met. The head teacher's always on the case. We've got Ofsted that come in. But, you know, it's just saying to those children, if anyone's sort of pushing you, shoving you in the playground, or if anyone's been nasty to you, come and tell us.
I think the one interesting point, I mean, on the sort of the way that we stand up, unfortunately we've seen, whether it's women's rights in the 30s, whether it's the black community and LGBT communities in the 60s and 70s, more so in America where they literally had to riot to try and get progression of rights, there becomes a tipping point, doesn't there? And I think that the one interesting thing is that we're talking about perpetrators, and it's absolutely right that the great work that you do, the Samaritans, the NSPCC, the Children's Societies, all these groups to help people who are suffering from having it perpetrated on them. The one thing socially I don't think we do enough of is look at the perpetrators as well. Why are they committing it? What relationships have they had go wrong? And, you know, we need to look more into that.
We're going to come back.
Sure.
We are actually going to come to that point in a minute. We're just going to take a break and we'll be right back. Welcome back. Now, just before the break, Lee, you touched on, and it was a question that I was going to put to the whole panel, about the perpetrators. Why is it that we don't actually look at why this person is committing the offence?
I think that there are some times that we find in our culture in this country, no matter what community you have, is that we tend to wait for things to go wrong and then sort of scrabble around how do we fix them afterwards. And I think in this particular case, it's not that we want people to perpetrate hate crime or bullying, but we don't really know how to get in before that. And I think we've discussed briefly about how schools should tackle it more, but also different communities should come together to tackle it. And I think that if we can try and stop it before it happens, because of course when people perpetrate it, they can get locked into that and then potentially further into drugs and criminal behaviour, so that they actually end up in a way having their own lives destroyed whilst they do damage to other people along the way. So it's quite right we focus on support for people who receive this bullying, because it is wrong and we need to clearly state that. But at the same time, we've got to understand there's a reason people are committing it. They don't get up in the morning and think, well, I'm a bit bored today, I'm going to go and bully somebody. You know, the old case of somebody maybe who was abused as a child might grow up to do the same. They might not. But we've got to understand that people do these things for a reason, and they've got to be seen as unacceptable, and we make it clear in school, in society, in families that it is. But it doesn't mean we ignore there's a reason why they've grown into it.
It's interesting that you say that people don't plan to commit these acts. However, if we look at history, the Ku Klux Klan, it was a planned event. They were a planned organisation. The National Front Party, planned. Yeah, that, you know, they knew exactly what they were doing, and they would talk about, you know, going and packy bashing was the term that they used. You know, if we look at slavery even further back, all of it's planned acts, really. And if we look at today's society, the acts are equally planned, because just because you happen to wear a turban, you happen to have a brown skin, you're a terrorist. Because your name is Mohammed, you belong to ISIS. You know, so all of this is very still, it's very much planned. Why do you think that people continue to plan it, but the government doesn't see it as a planned activity, Rose?
Well, I think there are obviously organisations and groups of people who plan things, but our concern and our experience is that this is actually the problem is it's every day, and it's ordinary people. Ordinary people are lashing out, and if something goes wrong, they are then abusing people, and then the number of people who hit someone's car door and then get racist abuse as a result of it, rather than this shouldn't have happened, but it's racist abuse. So I think there's a lot of ordinary people doing these activities, and ordinary people are standing by and letting it happen. So I don't think that the majority of incidents that people experience on a day-to-day basis are that planned. I think they are a result of this anger and this fear and this intolerance.
See, again, yes, I'd agree with that. I disagree that it's planned, because if you look at the very definition of hate, it's not a transient emotion. It's something. If you look at it psychologically, it's not a transient emotion. It's deep rooted, and you've got to go to the roots of the problem to draw the the poison out. I mean, even if we were talking about the perpetrator. What about the perpetrator? Now, the attention on the perpetrator can be like a double-edged sword. It can go one of two ways. Either you can, there's a need you don't want to sensationalize the perpetrator, and because if you reprimand the perpetrator to such an extent where afterwards he or she feels like he's got a badge on his shoulder, or he's made a notch in his belt, but you want to put the right kind of attention where you address the issues, and again that comes to your personal, your personality as well. How tolerant are you? Okay, you've got to be, we all should be tolerant of each other, but we should be tolerant of haters as well. People who hate. If we don't have a tolerance towards people who hate, how are we going to help that person and prevent and be preventative?
I think there's just one thing I've picked up over the years in terms of this word tolerance, and I completely agree with it. And that it's a reflection on one's good character to be tolerant of somebody you may find intolerant. But I think it's important that we perhaps say, if you wake up this morning and somebody says, "I tolerate you," does that sound good? Shouldn't we be looking at acceptance? And acceptance can include, "I disagree with you," or "I believe in this God," or "no God." And you can have an acceptance of disagreement. But I think that I think we've taken the word tolerance as almost, and this is not what you've said, but socially we've almost seen tolerance as the upper limit of what we can achieve, whereas really we should be moving to acceptance and actually agreeing to disagree and saying there's nothing wrong with having disagreements.
It's almost like tolerance is the political correctness gone wrong, really, is what you're suggesting. Sukhi, you said you work with children. Do you see planning events going on with children who are possibly bullied and who are bullies?
We don't in our school we try, and obviously, like you said, we will celebrate Eid, Diwali, and try and bring more understanding to the children why such a person's different, why they are dressed slightly different, why someone wears a headscarf, why someone's got, gears and stuff. But again, there's only so much that we can do in schools. Parents also have that responsibility, because fair enough, we're teaching this in school, but if at home their parents are, saying, don't hang around with these children, or, coloured people or whatever at home, the stuff that we do in school is just a waste.
I'd just like to add to that. I mean, fair enough, yes, something needs to be done at home, but the majority of a child's day is spent in school. A child is conditioned in school. And again, it's going back to what Lee is saying, schools should not be just about churning out kids who can write exams. It's about churning out citizens who live in who can live in a society and accept each other and be tolerant of each other. And you asked me a question earlier, what would I have wanted when I was 11? what I would have thinking back now in hindsight, you know, we only had a handful of citizenship lessons, or I don't know the proper name now, PGCE or something.
PHSE.
PHSE, that's the one.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't something which was given a lot of importance. And okay, back then, you know, when I was going to school in the 90s and, you know, and early noughties, you know, I see more importance for it now than then, because if you look at the media today, there is absolute sensationalization of terrorism in the news, and not so much for the right reason, but for the wrong reasons. Kids watch the news. Kids are so impressionable.
Well, I don't think there's a conscious decision there. They are just listening to what's around them in the same way as they listen to nursery rhymes and things. And I think in terms of we get what we deserve from the media, I think is a bit unfair, because actually if you see those headlines, you start to believe it because you haven't got a counter narrative. So you start to actually believe that's the case, and if you haven't got other experiences, then that's what you will believe. And say with and going back to the perpetrators, obviously that it's just an excuse. Actually, it's an excuse, and it's what's frightening is how kind of just below the surface it is for many people. If someone cuts me off up the road when I'm driving, I say, "Oh, what do you do that for?" I don't come out with some racist comment or some sexist comment. I just say, but for an awful lot of people, this is just below the surface, and it is about this ignorance and lack of opportunity to meet with other people, and just being downright horrible sometimes. And we don't know enough about perpetrators because we don't actually know who the perpetrators are, because most people aren't reporting it.
I think in workplaces you get a lot of training now. It's actually happening a lot in political parties as well, of unconscious bias, that all of us, without realising it, will have a bias of some description, sometimes positive, but also sometimes negative towards different groups of people. It is unfortunate. Again, this isn't to dismiss it, but if somebody were to come up to me and have an issue, they might immediately go, "Oh, you silly four eyes," because what people tend to do is they will focus on something physical and obvious. So it's the glasses, it's the turban, it's the headscarf, it's a female or a male, it's the age, and it's very difficult because humans have been seen for generations to naturally do that. So it's how we move towards. Again, it's about this acceptance, and I do think actually one of the key things is social media. See, social media isn't the problem; it's the way that it's used, and people go on and can commit abuse. But of course, it's also done some wonders. I mean, look at the wonders it's done with the attacks in France, for example, and how social media was used to share, come to us for help. And I heard about a wonderful case where a tweet had gone viral because the Gurdwara had been open, and lots of people had used it for support, and so it can actually be used well. And I think the more that we get children and teenagers involved, because what we also do in schools is we tend to try and ban phones and Twitter. Let's start using them, and let's start getting people to understand that, you know, things like social media are already a part of a teenager's life. When they get told off for being on their phone all the time, that isn't a phone, that's part of their very existence. So it's how we, as older people in many cases who maybe didn't grow up with that, try and understand how a teenager is now living, and that itself starts to allow us to start trying to understand how a teenager's mind works. Because you said the word adult, and I think that's really important, that we as adults too often assume children think like we do, and they don't, and it's hard for us to get through.
No, but children pick up what we give to them.
But yes, yeah.
It's easy for us to say children don't pick up what we give to them, or they don't think like us. But it's like Sukhi was saying, at school you might teach a child tolerance, tolerance, tolerance. As soon as they go home, they're picking up the adults' behaviour. So it is what adults are doing to them. It is what, you know, we are.
But how do we control what parents do? That's not something we can do, is it?
No, but it is. But then we can't equally just blame the media all the time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, the media has a part to play. Because, you know, but then as a community, don't you think that we want that sensationalisation? Because if you don't want something, go to a grocery shop. You ain't going to pick up apples if you want them. If you don't want them, they ain't going to, you know, put them on the stack again. And that's, you know.
But this is why the school has to be the balance. The school has to be that source of, you know, providing that balance. So with the
PHSE.
so those PHSE classes, which are ever so important now more than ever, to be teaching children how to be how to grow into responsible adults. And you know, kids have got a conscience as well. When you're showing them proper examples, and you know, they'll be able to weigh in their heads, you know, are my parents right, or is this the right way to be? And it's about creating that positive environment within school as well, which
I thoroughly agree with you. Just very quickly, if I may, I think the one thing, and I can say this as a politician, I've had it thrown at me, that the people want the school to do that and they want the teachers to be involved. However, I will tell you that a lot of those people will also say, don't you dare interfere in how I raise my child. That's for me to raise them. It's not for the school to act as a parent. But of course, the school is, to use the phrase in loco parentis, whilst that child is spending 8 hours a day away from their parents. So how do we draw the line between, I want you to intervene to help them, but I don't want you to intervene because you're messing with their lives? It's very difficult.
Sukhi?
That's hard because we see it, like I said, in the classroom. Parents say, you know, you can't. It's once the kid's out of school, it's my responsibility as a parent. Once they're in school, you can do what you want. So I don't know. That's a very difficult one because you can't just necessarily just blame the teachers. You know, it's if you look at the wider picture, it starts from home because you know it's a parent. I think it's a parent's responsibility at first. Yes, schools do need to do more. Obviously, when I was in school, we didn't have mobile phones, we didn't have social media. So it was literally in school. And as soon as I left school, I know I was safe because she couldn't get me. The bully couldn't get me. However, now when you see, you know, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, you know, the bullies are just constantly there. And when you read some of these stories, you know, the 13-year-old boy who you just couldn't cope, he hanged himself. It got that bad that, you know, he just couldn't turn off from the bullies. So
I was going to come to you about depression because, I mean, one of the things that is significant in anybody who's been a victim of any form of hatred, any form of crime, tends to go through or could go through depression, really. And I know that you're the party chair on depression. How does it affect the person, the victim or the survivor?
It does, and I will add in again, of course, it will affect the perpetrator, or even often they might be in a condition to start with that may be helping to, helping is the wrong word, maybe causing this. So when we look at the victims or survivors, the problem is that once you can suffer depression at a young age, you're much more likely to either have repeat depression as you get older, or what can happen often. I mean, it was never clinical because it was never diagnosed because I never brought it up. I never at the time told my parents about being bullied. I know looking back now with my experience, my knowledge, I had mild depression. And it's something that has stayed with me. It's not something, depression doesn't actually switch off. You are lucky if you can develop tools to help you manage it on a day-to-day or monthly basis. But it's not something that really, it can do sometimes, but it doesn't generally go away. So once somebody experiences depression or anxiety or developed eating disorders, all of these range of issues under the mental health umbrella, it can affect them so bad because if they have that in their early years, it makes it much more difficult in later years. And then if they start in their teenage years now, we're getting people being prescribed antidepressants, and it's a cycle that can get worse as they get older. So it's really important that they have the support at the young age.
Rose?
Yeah, a lot of the people who contact us for help are people who have a damaged mental health, and they're either being targeted because of their mental health, or because their mental health has been damaged by their experiences, and because of that they feel unable to access mainstream services. You know, they don't present themselves well when they go and talk to statutory bodies such as the police, and so they their life just closes down around them in many cases, and so people will come to us when they've just got nowhere else to turn, and for some people, you know, they're so distressed at the point of contacting us they can barely breathe, you know, in terms of how distressing these incidents have been to them, and trying to unravel kind of what's happened and how it's happened, and try to move them on to getting to some support. And it's partly because people seek support so late. They don't come when it first happens, and so by the time they come for help, they're already damaged.
You know, if it is because they're bullying someone because of the colour of their skin, it's important to educate them. You know, just so they know why it's wrong to do that. We have got bullying policies in place in school, but it's just sort of, I think it's important to sort of educate them about it.
I think in schools and communities, as we've sort of said before, I think it's very good and right that we make a clear statement that it is unacceptable. And I think that so many times I've come across it, it's because, and it sounds like a cliche from an American teen drama story, but it's very true in many cases where they're actually seeking attention. Unfortunately, the life they've been given by their parents or their communities or their families has been that the negative attention is the thing that pulls out people to notice them. And I think that when you start giving them opportunities, so many of it, I've come across experiences, they have amazing talents in art and crafts, or the ability to design and build things. Or one case I remember, there's a guy who was amazing on computers, but because his friends weren't in that, he didn't want to go on a computer for fear of being himself bullied within his group about being a nerd or something. So giving them those sorts of opportunities and allowing them to develop their own skills is something suddenly that they recognise, somebody's recognised them for something other than being shouted at or pulling them in for detention or something. It's
Absolutely, and that one act can overshadow their whole academic career, for example, and where a teacher maybe even subconsciously has a prejudice towards that child, thinking, oh, he's always going to mess around, you know what, just forget about it. He's got there's no hope, he's a lost he's a lost case. And I think it boils down to what I mentioned before about recognizing and understanding that even the perpetrator is still a human being as well. And fair enough, yes, I absolutely agree, the act is not acceptable, and that needs to be made clear. But there is a need, again, for the person who's handling the situation to handle it from an objective perspective as well, and not let their emotions come in, override their professional ability. Again,
I think sometimes we have to help people understand what the impact of what they've done, and also that it could be that the person is damaged or been targeted about something themselves, or experiencing some sort of trauma. But it's also, so it's about helping with that. But it's also about understanding that actually, if I do this to you, somebody else is going to do it to me, and actually accept. It goes back to that we're all different. So if I don't want to be targeted, I shouldn't be targeting somebody else. And I think there needs to be a lot more work done on that. And I don't think people often do realise the emotional impact of what they're doing. And sometimes they think, oh, it's a bit of a laugh.
I think we see things so defined as well as perpetrator and victim, when often the perpetrator is a victim themselves, and it just, like you say, it can go on.
Young people are perpetrators and victims, all wrapped up in one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you think then, given that the perpetrator could have been a victim themselves, and therefore they're repeating that behaviour of becoming the abuser, do you think then that punishment is going to give them another feather in their cap? Because obviously hate crime, it's a crime, and there is going to be consequences for that, and that's going to be from a legal perspective. Obviously from school they might be expelled, but they might not be able to sit their exams, but then they might get another opportunity. But once they've got a criminal record, it's almost like gives them justification for their continual behaviour. Do you think that's the right way to go down the road?
See, again, it's points we mentioned, touched upon before. We don't want to criminalise children. You don't want to set them down a path, which is it's a whirlpool going down. And I think, again, I'm banging on about it, but it has to be in the schools through PHSC. I'm going to write this time, right? It has to be about teaching kids not only relevant situation, current affairs, current topics, about tolerance and acceptance.
But I think I have little faith in our system of supposed rehabilitation. We see people, they're often called colleges of crime, where people who've committed crimes of all sorts of varying degrees, from burglary to hate crimes and everything, is they go in and they get they learn things in prison. They don't get rehabilitated. They come out. What happens? They effectively become victims themselves, because they get ostracised by the communities, they're not accepted by their friends, family, they can't get a job, so they end up turning back to the same similar sorts of crimes and going back in, and we get a cycle. So I don't think punishment works, because prison doesn't work, despite what many politicians say. I don't agree with them. It doesn't work. We need a better system.
Sukhi, these are your final words, because we are coming to the end of the show.
I just want to say, if someone is being bullied, speak up, stand up, speak to somebody. There is someone that you can speak to in the classroom, in the school, teacher, dinner lady. Just tell someone, I wish I had. If you're someone that's the perpetrator, so you're about to bully someone, just think twice. Why are you about to do that? If that person looks different, or if they dress different, you're in school, ask questions. We encourage children to ask questions all the time. If you're unsure why they look different, just ask. No one's going to say anything to you. You won't be into trouble because you're asking questions. Again, it's about educating yourself and having that knowledge. So yeah, just speak up.
Yeah. And we do need interventions about changing behaviour. Your point about prison, you can go into prison having committed a racist aggravated crime, and no one will challenge or deal with that racism, and so it just grows, and then your family think you've been hard done by because you've got a harder sentence. So that racism grows. So it is about this zero tolerance. It is about messages around. Yes, we're going to do some other interventions, but actually this could have been giving you a criminal record. I think we do have to have some harsh realities with young people, and so sometimes the police coming in and talking to schools can help. But it's very important for people to understand the consequences of their actions and where this path could lead them.
And so we come to the end of another programme. The theme that is running through all of these shows is one thing, and that is about education. Without education, we are going to continue to face hatred from other people. So all we'd like to say is, when you're at home with your children and you do see them picking up on negative behaviour, challenge that, because that may encourage them to continue that behaviour later on, and they may end up being a bully or themselves being bullied. Till next week, from us, Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.